What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 17 in season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. Today I'm talking with Dr Simon Longstaff, the Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, based in Sydney, Australia. Simon began his working life on Groote Eylandt in the Northern Territory, where he worked in the safety department of the then BHP subsidiary GEMCO. He is proud of his kinship ties with the members of the island's Indigenous community. Following a period studying law in Sydney and a brief career teaching in Tasmania, Simon undertook postgraduate studies in philosophy as a member of the Magdalene College, Cambridge. Simon commenced his work as the first Executive Director of the Ethics Centre in 1991. Simon is a Fellow of the CPA Australia and in June 2016 was appointed an Honorary Professor at the Australian National University, based at the National Centre for Indigenous Studies. Formerly serving as the inaugural President of the Australian Association of Professional and Applied Ethics, Simon serves on a number of boards and committees across a broad spectrum of activities. He was formerly a Fellow of the World Economic Forum. The Ethics Centre, previously known as the St James Ethics Centre, is an independent not-for-profit organisation that has been working for over 25 years to help people navigate the complexity and uncertainty of difficult ethical issues. The Ethics Centre delivers innovative programs, services and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of professional and personal life and align actions with values and principles. In this episode, I speak with Simon about how democracy and ethics interact, both ideally and in practice. Thanks so much for joining me today, Simon. From your perspective, can representative democracy be considered an ethical political system?
Well, representative democracy is, at its essence, an ethical system, principally because it requires the representative to exercise their best judgment, taking into account the public interest. So, for example, representative democracy can be distinguished from other democratic systems, either participatory democracy, where the electorate as a whole will make decisions from time to time, or hybrid systems in which the representative, in fact, is merely a delegate, carrying forward the views of the electorate. In our system, what we require the electorate to do is to exercise its judgment as to the character and quality of those people who seek election, and in doing so, form a view about their capacity to act in the general interest, the public interest, when called upon to do so when exercising their power to deliberate and vote in Parliament. And in turn, this requires the representative to be able to bring to bear their best judgment, not merely doing what their electorate wants, which is often very easy to discern, but instead engaging in that ethically more challenging task of discerning the interests of the electorate. And you can see, for example, times in the past where perhaps even a majority of people might have been in favour of something like capital punishment, and where if they were merely a delegate, then the members of Parliament would vote accordingly. Whereas in the ethical environment of representative democracy, we've consistently seen our members of Parliament note what their electorate might want, but vote no to capital punishment, having formed the view that capital punishment would not be in the interests of the community as a whole. So whenever you've got something where people actually have to think about what they're going to do, when they have to be able to give reasons for the choices they make, and particularly when they do so with a view to the interests of others, grounded in some explicit framework of values and principles, then you have a strong ethical framework for the development of a political culture.
And despite, I suppose, your view that it is an ethical system, there is, surveys around the world suggest that citizens are losing trust in democracy. From your perspective, what role does trust play when you consider the ethical dimensions of democracy?
Well, democracy is a peculiarly vulnerable system, despite its great success in many countries. And its vulnerability lies particularly in regard to what happens when the trust in the system begins to decline And secondly, if it goes even further, and there's a much more terrible thing than a loss of trust, which is a loss of legitimacy. But equally, it's also vulnerable in the fact that democracies do not have available to them all of the tools of other systems to address complex problems. So, for example, if you're living in a society which has a single government, which is in some senses totalitarian but benign, this can be able to respond to challenges, say, like climate change or any other pressing community concern. It can respond very firmly, definitely and swiftly. Yet, if you look at democracies, they can be messy. They can be undermined when political parties begin to contend for power mainly on the basis of holding power for its own sake, rather than necessarily with a clear vision of what would make for a good society. In other words, they don't always know exactly what they would do with the power that they have. So if I could just go back to the problem about trust and the limitations of democracy. If you, in a democratic society, don't trust those who make the laws, then there's a very grave risk that in time you will not trust the laws that those people make. You will see those laws often being formed for the satisfaction of the partial interests of some lobbying group, or perhaps for the interests of the political parties or the people in government at a time. And if you don't trust the laws that are being made, then the temptation begins to grow that you will act in a manner which is outside of that law. You'll take matters into your own hands. You will disregard the law not as a conscientious objective, but simply because you think there's no point really applying it, because it doesn't bear consideration that this is a legitimate law. Now, this is a very, very dangerous situation, and we've seen it in some Australian jurisdictions where it's got quite close to that point. For example, in New South Wales, where there was a long streak of corruption involving the Labor Party and then, to some degree, also the Liberal and National parties, people began to lose trust in the institution of Parliament itself. And of course, Parliament is not a plaything of politicians. It's not something they own to do with as they wish. It's something which is for the benefit of the people. To the extent they have any involvement with Parliament, it's to hold it, if you like, as a public trust. But when the community loses faith in the political class and the laws they make, then you would hope that the democracy would be able to respond. But of course, the messiness I mentioned before gets in the way. And so if you're not careful, you can start to get quite a vicious cycle that begins to emerge. And that's where it requires very considerable skills of leadership to try and put the democratic process back into shape, where the community trusts the politicians, trusts the institutions are being used for their proper purposes, trust that laws are being enacted for the public good and not to satisfy partial interest, and therefore trusting the system as a whole, are willing to abide by the laws and participate in a political process which has legitimacy.
Some people argue that ethical politics is an oxymoron, and others that elected representatives shouldn't be bound by ethical standards. Rather, they need to focus on the public interest without limitations. You've earlier spoken about one of the values of democracy is that politicians can, in fact, put the common interest or the common good or so on ahead of the people that elected them, that sort of thing. How do you feel about that sort of idea about ethical politics being an oxymoron or elected representatives not needing to be bound by ethical standards?
Well, firstly, in terms of the separation between ethics and politics, it's worth just looking at a little bit of intellectual history. So when Aristotle was writing two of his great works that we know of, one called The Ethics and the other called The Politics, they were both conceived of by Aristotle as being different sides of the same coin. So ethics was effectively written as being about what is a good life for an individual person, and politics was taken to be a question about what is a good life for a society. So in a sense, the two parts are inseparable. And certainly in the earliest form of democratic politics, which involved all citizens, this was considered to be one of the most noble and meaningful things that you could do as a citizen. It was something to which one might aspire, and it was a broad community practice in which one engaged. So one can't begin with the idea of politics or ethics without thinking of the two things in some ways being joined together. Now, as to then what happens for representatives in a representative democracy, given the latitude that they have to exercise judgment about what constitutes the public interest, and given the fact that the community is being asked at the time of an election to make an informed choice as to who will stand in the parliament on their behalf, it is absolutely essential that the politician who seeks election be able to articulate a very clear vision of the values and principles, that is, the ethical foundation on which they will stand when deliberating as the representative of that electorate. Because if they don't set that out, then it's impossible for the electorate to make an informed decision. And if they are not making an informed decision, if their choice is based on a lie, a false promise, or on ignorance, then the whole foundation for democracy begins to crumble, because democracy is ultimately about all authority coming from those who are the governed. Authority in a democracy doesn't come from God or from the nobility or from a king, it's from the people. And any divorce between ethics and politics completely destroys the capacity of democracy, and particularly representative democracy, to operate as it ought to do.
And how do you see political parties fitting in there? Because in terms of the individual representatives, when they're standing for election, articulating a clear vision, often their vision is very much set by the party's platform. Do you see that as having any impact on their ability to be clear about their ethical judgment, or party sort of constraints having an impact there?
Well, the role of political parties and their connection with candidates is a very interesting one. I mean, in the ideal situation, what you should have is a person seeking election joining a political party because A, the individual is clear about their own values and principles, and B, they find a political party which has a platform which is in alignment with those things. It becomes far more difficult when politicians surrender, if you like, their own conscience into the hand of the party and simply join a party for general purposes or because they think it might advance their career, and then seek to suppress their own values and principles merely to fit in with the group, namely in the form of the party. Now, I can understand there's a certain amount of compromise required whenever you join another group. You can't impose upon that group your own idiosyncratic views, but you really shouldn't be in a party if it doesn't have a broad alignment with your own values and principles, which you then are quite authentic in offering as a basis for your deliberations when you stand before the people at the time of an election. If those two things are true, if you are clear about your own values and principles and the party's own platform is in alignment with those things, then it becomes a quite palatable alternative. It's just joining a group of people with a like-minded view of the world, with some common objectives, who are agreeing to cooperate in order to help realise those through the political process. That's healthy. If, on the other hand, you've got a group of people who are being shoehorned into an ideological position which is not really an accurate reflection of their true beliefs, merely in order to be in a better position to contend for power, then that starts to corrupt the democratic process.
Yes. I've had some guests say that they just thought we should get rid of parties altogether, but I'm not sure that that's likely to happen.
Well, there are alternatives. So in terms of whether or not parties are something that ought to be retained in a democracy that we might aspire to have, they're the only things we know at the moment, but there are other formations one could consider. You might consider, for example, what I call charter groups. These are people who are more independent than party members, so they don't in fact join a party, but they might all subscribe to a common framework for good government and agree to support each other. So you have certain things which are tightly defined and within which everybody agrees to operate, and things which are much looser than that. And that would provide an essential platform for reasonably stable government without having the vice-like grip that some parties, particularly the Labor Party, seeks to exercise in controlling its members. So it's just that we've got used to parties as the only basis for people operating, or independence, where there may be some other novel forms which we've not yet actually experimented with within our own representative democracy.
And we certainly have as you sort of alluded to, the very strong two-party process, whereas in Europe and a lot of other places, they've got much more expansive range of parties and they're much more used to what we might call minority government. Is there anywhere that's actually, is there somewhere that people could look to see the charter group's idea in practice, or is this something that you've developed as a? It's
something I've developed. I don't think there's anything like it. Usually there is. If you have an idea in one place, usually someone else is having it, and it may be that there are precursors. It's just something that I've been trying to work through as an alternative to the party system at the moment, which I think, because it's the only way one can get to exercise executive power, if that's what you want to do, it can actually distort the judgment of representatives. A more general point I'd make is that I think we need to do far more to elevate the role of a parliamentarian as a really serious opportunity for making a contribution, because at the moment, if people go into parliamentary politics, ultimately they aspire to form government and to then be a minister or a prime minister or a premier. And of course, if you're in a party, whoever controls access to the executive part of government can effectively lure you to make decisions which will smooth your path, even though it may not be, strictly speaking, in accordance with your duty to act in the best interests of the electorate you serve. And I just think that can be quite a grave distortion to the system. Whereas if we had something a little bit more like the United States, where their members of Congress are at least as well respected as people in the executive, and they're remunerated well for their committee work and they have status and all the rest, then you might go into Parliament in Australia and say, well, I aspire just to be a great parliamentarian. And then if you add to that the charter group idea, then you start to, if you like, open the weave in the texture of parliamentary politics in Australia. Now, that's all going to work as long as you have representative democracy. It may be that in the future we have a different form of democracy, much more oriented towards participation from communities under a process like sortition, in which people are randomly selected to be legislators. And it may be that that evolves because in a world where there's less paid employment because of the rise of artificial intelligence and robots and things, that people derive most of their meaning in life not through their employment, but through the quality of work they do as a citizen, much as they might have done in a place like ancient Athens. So the system may evolve, but either way, I think, to the extent that the parties can draw people away from these broader issues about their duty to act in the public interest, so they will be problematic and they'll invite novel responses.
I spoke recently with Professor John Keane about monitory democracy, and one of the challenges of the different types of monitory institutions is that they're actually created by the people they're intended to monitor. And I'm wondering what your view is about how elected representatives can be supported to adopt a more ethical approach to their role.
Well, I think the first thing you've got to do is find a common ethical foundation on which, as a minimum level, if you like, all elected politicians are prepared to operate. So I developed a couple of years ago a thing called the Politician's Pledge, which attempts to establish that minimum foundation, something which reaches across all parties, age, class, whether it's state parliament, federal parliament, a territory, whatever. And if you get that in place, then not only do you get formal systems of accountability or the kind of institutions that John Keane conceives of in his idea of monetary democracy, but you also get another very strong element, which is of interpersonal accountability between members of parliament or other legislatures, and also a kind of interpersonal accountability between the elected member of an electorate and those who elected them. But they remain more equal in that sense about holding each other to account. So that's the first step, a common ethical foundation for all people contending for and exercising power. The second thing is that providing people act in accordance with that, then you should build up the stock of trust between those representatives and the community, because ultimately we entrust these people to make very, very big decisions involving life and death matters affecting the community and individuals within it. So it should be within their purview, if we let them do that, also to be trusted to make some appropriate standard applications around things like monetary democracy. And the third thing I'd say is the whole world doesn't have to revolve around the former politician. There are opportunities here for citizens themselves to become far more involved in the way these things. But the last point is that institutions can be judged in a whole range of different ways. One is to say, well, are they practically effective and do they work? So do they produce the kind of outcomes that you'd want? But there's also issues to do with the quality of their own intrinsic design. In other words, are they fit for the purpose they're meant to serve? And so when you come to something like monetary democracy, you need to be very, very clear about what is the purpose of each of the institutions that you establish as part of such a regime. And then you've got to be very sure as well that when you design them, they are actually being fit for that purpose and that you're not imparting things because it's simply convenient or it's a sop to a particular group. That there's a kind of purity around purpose and design so that they operate. And then once you've got that in place, the operators themselves can be selected from a diverse group.
And here in New South Wales, we have the Independent Commission Against Corruption. And I suppose this is a very Australian-centric question, but I know there's a lot of talk about the need for a similar body federally here in Australia. Do you support that, would you see it needs to be the same or very similar to the New South Wales version or different?
Well, I think, yes, you probably do. I mean, this isn't to say that there are large cases of corruption in public life in the Commonwealth sphere, although you don't know sometimes until these sorts of bodies are established. But generally there seems to have been a pretty good record. But look, I think there are a range of functions that could be combined in such a body, and it probably is time to do it, not least because it may actually help to rebuild some of the trust which is vital for the operation of representative democracy, including at the federal level where so much trust has been lost. As to its particular powers, I think I'd rather focus still at the level of principle. So it needs to be independent and apolitical. It needs to be easily accessible. It needs to have the powers necessary to investigate allegations of corrupt conduct or other forms of wrongdoing that might be there. But it also needs to do it in a way which not only inspires the trust of the community, but doesn't recklessly put at risk the reputations for individuals who might be tainted by some suspicion but ultimately be found not to have done anything wrong. So it's a balance of competing goods, and the balance itself needs to be resolved by not what is in the interest of politicians or bureaucrats or any of the actors within such a system, but always coming back again to say, what would such and such a design do in order to help promote and secure the public good?
I've spoken to a number of academics in particular around the relationship between representative democracy and market economies, capitalism. From your perspective, what impact does this close relationship between democracy and capitalism have on the ethics of representative democracy?
Well, capitalism itself and the idea of free markets only makes sense with a very strong ethical foundation of its own. So a lot of people don't necessarily realise this, but Adam Smith, great Scottish thinker who is often credited with being the father of modern capitalism through his work, The Wealth of Nations, he was not an economist. He was Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And his other great work, which predates The Wealth of Nations, is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And it's in that book that the idea of the invisible hand first appears. And so when Adam Smith is talking about the market, and particularly the free market, he has a very clear understanding that markets can only be free if they have an ethical foundation which makes it clear that you cannot lie, you cannot cheat, and you cannot use power oppressively without, in fact, undermining the freedom of the market that you seek to achieve. And when he says that it's not through benevolence that the butcher, the brewer or the baker makes provision for your dinner, that may be true. They may be motivated by self-interest, but how they provide for those things is dependent upon the work he did earlier in the theory of moral sentiments, where it must be guided by these virtues of sympathy and reciprocity. So the market itself only makes sense as a free market if it's got this ethical foundation. And if that's what it's doing, if it's realising its essential purpose, which effectively can be caught in a very simple image of two people who might meet at the ford in the stream, and on one side there's a person who has wool, and on the other side there's a person who has wheat, and one of them's cold and the other's hungry, then that's the perfect idea of the market, a simple exchange of value amongst two people who need one thing or the other. Now, politics, if it's properly understood, ought to be a very comfortable bedfellow for an ethical market of that kind. It ought to have its own values and principles. It ought to be operating for the public interest. And that's because the market, as conceived by people like Adam Smith, has no intrinsic value of its own. It only exists, its only justification is if it actually leads to an increase in the stock of common good. So the market is a tool for making us all better off. Politics is a tool for making us all better off. And if the true purpose of politics and the true purpose of markets was understood and given effect, then of course this would be very good for the whole community. Unfortunately, what happens is instead of having free markets, we'll often have laissez-faire, where laissez-faire is a different kind of thing where people will get as much as they can for themselves with minimum rules. Politics can degrade similarly into a contest of power without any clear reason for its purpose. And these things corrupt the ideal notion of those institutions. And the task of all of us is to call politicians and those operating in the market back to the higher ideal which informed the original creation of their institutions.
That's wonderful. Nobody else has covered that. Thank you for joining me today. The next episode of Real Democracy Now! Podcast will be the last one in Season 2 and will be part 4 of the One Change to Democracy set. After that, I'll be taking a break to put together Season 3, which is all about elections, voting and alternatives. And I'd like to remind you, if you have any ideas for a question to replace the question, if you could change one thing about democracy, what would it be? Please let me know. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.